Justice Report,
Hey.
an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. We've already had some donations just in the last hours. We have a special event today that we're very happy to have with us Ron Aronson, who is the distinguished professor at Wayne State University. He is well known as a Sartre scholar, having published on Sartre and Camus. He's also, well, among his other books, Living Without God, New Directions for Atheists, Agnostics, and the Undecided. I guess that covers just about everybody. One of his recent books I want to commend to you especially is We, Recovering, or Reviving Social Hope. Much of what he's going to be saying today in his discussion of the revival of socialism today is prefigured in this book. This book is not written for socialists and doesn't explicitly make that link, but we'll hear today what the link is. So I want to give as much time as possible to Ron. We will do this kind of as a dialogue or an exchange. There are many people here in the Zoom room. Some of you I can see who will want to contribute to the discussion or ask questions of Ron. So we want to have as much space as possible for that. So let me give the floor to Ron Aronson. Whoop. Excuse me, I made a mistake there. I spotlighted someone else. Okay, Ron, if you unmute yourself.
Unmute. Okay.
Good.
Ready. Okay. I just had an interesting exchange with Carl Davidson, a prominent activist of my generation, about the visions of socialism, a future vision. And Carl saw on the DSA North Star website what I was about with this discussion today, and posted on the website something that he's probably used many times. He likes it. He says he hasn't seen anything to really overturn this set of ideas. it's a fairly lengthy list of points about what socialism will look like. And he goes through everything from military policy to foreign policy to the way the economy will be arranged. And it's all in response to my what is socialism? Well, Carl's is a vision. It's something for brainstorming, thinking about, talking about, and has a lot of uses. Would be a lot of fun. Be a lot of fun to work with. I'm interested in something much narrower, and what I'm interested in is young people becoming socialists today are young people raised in an incredibly individualist, sometimes we say neoliberal culture. And it's fairly remarkable that they have come to socialism. And one of my questions is why? What is leading a large number of young people to, for example, DSA has something like 90,000 members, but there are many, many other socialist trends organizations, individuals, freelancers. So the numbers are pretty impressive. So impressive that nothing like that, as people explicitly calling themselves socialists, has happened in my lifetime. On the one hand, on the other hand, so I think it's an important and fascinating question. We understand why, particularly those of us who have been socialists our whole lives and have been used to being members of other movements, never a socialist movement, but feminist movements and anti-war movements and civil rights movements and you name it. And we've also been socialists, but never usually got a chance to talk about that. But today, people are explicitly socialists and are talking about it. So what's happening there? One, why are they coming to that? And number two, what do they mean by socialism? That raises a whole series of really interesting questions because the common views of socialism today are not what they were, let's say, 70 years ago. There's a very sharp difference. So we need to talk about that. But first of all, why are young people coming? To make the question sharper, by and large, young people have been raised in, as I say, this neoliberal culture in which they've been raised by their parents and by the environment to make it on their own, to be individuals, to be responsible for themselves, to solve social problems through individual means. Resume writing has become one of the major activities of people going through college. For example, how you will present yourself. And that's only one little example, but there are many, many examples. But the overall mood is you're on your own. The economy has been supposed to be a free market economy, and that free market economy is going to deliver the best result. Well, we know that isn't true, but young people are raised in that belief, and that's been the cultural belief very powerfully since roughly the mid-70s, when the Thatcherite and then Reaganite neoliberal culture began to seep in ever more deeply. So in that society, it's even more remarkable that young people should defy their upbringing and their parents and look for a different orientation. Of course, there are reasons, there are obvious reasons. The growth economy of capitalism, since, let's say, roughly 1975, has fundamentally stalled. The 30 golden years between 45 and 75 have been followed by a kind of one endless, if not crisis, then slump, then regression, and a rise in austerity, a cutting back of the welfare state. And this is throughout the advanced societies, particularly in the United States. And what's happened is there has been, instead of the prospect of going to college and finding good employment for young people, there is the prospect of going to college, taking more time than one ever expected, accruing a huge debt, and not finding the kind of employment you would expect. So the exit poll of Bernie voters, for example, in Michigan last March, the exit poll shows that there were a very high percentage of young people with college degrees making under $50,000 a year. And that interesting combination of people with degrees who were poor wound up being one of the main sources of Bernie voters. People for whom the opportunity expected isn't panning out. And so that's clearly one reason why young people would begin to question the capitalist economy. Another reason, of course, is the environment. I probably need not say much more about that, except young people are raised to be environmentally conscious in a way that our generation hasn't, and for obvious reasons. Things are simply getting worse, more dangerous environmentally. No one can deny it anymore. So that's a second reason. A third reason people would be driven to question the source of the economic source of environmental problems, or the economic source of our lost opportunities, are also questioning the economic source of inequality, which has risen incredibly over the past generation. So all of these reasons, if one is looking for economic, environmental, and personal reasons to move away from neoliberal individualism and to move towards seeing yourself as part of a wider society, those are all good reasons. There's a further reason, and the further reason is, if anybody has studied, taken seriously, thought about, followed what became neoliberalism starting in the mid-70s, you can't ignore the fact of how stupid it is. And when I say stupid, what I mean is that it doesn't make sense. It doesn't describe reality. It describes a fantasy world. And I could talk about that in more detail, but the experience we have increasingly today, especially with young people, is of belonging in an interconnected way to an ever more complicated world, but in which you are hooked up, linked in with all sorts of other people. You belong to a larger world. You are not that atom or isolated individual of neoliberalism, which people don't really experience. They experience their interconnectedness. And to experience interconnectedness and to see it in terms of the global threat to the environment, and then to hear neoliberal nostrums about each of us as separate and each of us as atoms and each of us is responsible, you realize it simply doesn't describe the reality people are living. And so the experience of people, the sense of being social beings, which people really are in a sense more than ever, runs totally contrary to the neoliberal individualism with which people have been brought up. And what I like to highlight is the fact that people are recoiling from that. I called it stupidity. People are recoiling from it and searching out connections. And the most obvious one is to see yourself as a social being, to think instead of individualism, to think of socialism, and to see yourself as part of something larger, to protect the planet, to remove inequality, to provide health care for people, to provide college education. And all of these things become a not only natural recoil, but a natural direction to move in. And so we have the remarkable and marvelous phenomenon of many young people, and notably a majority of women, being willing to call themselves socialists. So let me pause there because I think Cliff might want to come in with some either thoughts or questions.
Well, I would just add one thought related to the pandemic. I think, in a way, the pandemic has taught many of us what could well be described as a socialist principle, a kind of ethic of caring. You know, in the pandemic, we wear masks to take care of not just self, but to protect others as well. And that concern for the well-being of others is part of the ethic, it seems to me, that could be called socialist. Now, we have seen that there's quite a division that has emerged in US society between those who do believe in taking care of others, practicing an ethic of caring, and those who don't, who repudiate it, who assert a very individualistic ethic of based upon a really weird concept of freedom. Namely, freedom means I'm able to do whatever I want, regardless of its consequences for others. You know, so we've seen, it seems to me, a very interesting division emerge in US society around exactly this point.
Right. You could talk about the all in it togetherness of a significant part of American society and the rejection of the all in it togetherness. For a minute, sometime last March, most Americans went along with social distancing, went along with public health measures. And it didn't last. By the middle of April, you'll recall two things happened, very remarkable. One was the armed demonstration at the Michigan State Capitol against social distancing and against the mask wearing and so on the one hand. And the other hand, Trump saying, liberate Michigan. Whereas when the president, who had not been doing much of a decent job anyhow, really sided himself with the individualist response to the pandemic he was supposed to be managing. So we have a striking opposition. People talk about a civil war today. Well, if there is, one of the themes is that sense of those of us who are willing to see ourselves as connected, all in it together, and those who absolutely refuse that and have this notion of individual freedom as total irresponsibility. Right.
Mhm. Well, and then coming out of the pandemic, this past spring, we got the Black Lives Matter movement, where large numbers of young people, in response to the killing of George Floyd, um, were galvanized to protest against police violence against Black people. And I think that can maybe in part, I mean, it was really unprecedented, not only in its scale, but its duration, and the fact that it wasn't mainly Black people who were protesting Black violence or police violence, as had typically been the case before, but large numbers of white youth as well. And I don't know, I have this hypothesis that that may have something to do with the fact that they've in the spring emerged from their exile from society and come out into society and found that the police certainly were not abiding by the ethic that they had been practicing while they were hunkered down at home.
Right. Well, the all in it together experience was at the same time an awareness, sometimes very sharp, of the inequality between the essential workers, many of whom were Black and brown, who had a much higher mortality rate during the pandemic than whites. The inequality of people who, essential workers getting lower pay, having to go to work, not able to work at home. There was a lot of discussion about how unfair the whole regime of the pandemic was on the one hand, and on the other hand, how many of us privileged individuals were depending on people much poorer than ourselves and much more in danger than ourselves. So the pandemic did cause a sharpened awareness of the links. And although some people were cynical about all in it together as a theme, on the other hand, there was an experience of people being dependent on the ones who brought our groceries, or the ones who shop for our groceries, or the ones who were delivering food or delivering items we bought, or protecting us, or the doctors and nurses at the hospitals. I mean, my God, there's a sense, a powerful sense of interdependency that developed during the pandemic. And I think you're right to connect that with the what I call the uprising of the George Floyd uprising, which saw tens of millions of people demonstrating. And what does it mean when you stand on a street corner with a Black Lives Matter sign, and this could be in suburban Detroit, in Royal Oak, Michigan, and cars drive by and they're honking. And you can see an average in an hour of 500 horn honks in that hour. That is to say, people, giving you thumbs up or waving to you or honking or sharing that sense that Black Lives Matter. What does that mean? It's something new, I think. Going around my suburban neighborhood, I've calculated that 1 in every 7 homes has either Black Lives Matter or We Believe with the more complicated sign, but Black Lives Matter being part of it. If 1 in 7 houses in a largely white middle-class suburb carries Black Lives Matter signs, what is that saying? I think it's saying people are aware, as they've never been before, of the structural, what people are talking about, using the word structural inequality, structural racism, systemic racism, that there's something going on that is sort of beneath the surface of individual striving that has to be dealt with, so that when you have, the new president sworn to deal with this issue, whatever he does is another issue. But the fact is, there's an awareness in American society of the connection with Black people and the structural problems Black and brown people face, that fundamental inequality that doesn't seem to go away. And that's part of, so I think you're right, the pandemic has, if anything, increased that consciousness.
And then what do people mean when they call themselves socialists, or when they say that they have favorable attitudes toward the socialist idea? What is socialism when people talk that way?
Well, I know you have some particular information you wanted to share, but before you do that, let me just say this. Twice as many people today as 70 years ago, when they hear socialism, twice as many people think in terms of equality. Half as many people, when they hear the word socialism today, think in terms of nationalizing industry or big business.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a shift over the years in what people mean when they say socialism. But do you want to share the specifics that we had talked about, or should I dig them up?
Well, I have them here.
Okay,
These
good.
are statistics from a Harris poll that that you quote in your article in Tikkun, asking people were asked what they considered to be a part of a socialist political system. And there were a list of things. Universal health care was seen as a part of a socialist political system by 76% of the respondents. Tuition-free education was seen as socialist by 72%. A living wage by 68%. A state-controlled economy by 66%. State control and regulation of private property was seen as socialist by 61%. High taxes for the rich by 60%. State-controlled media and communication by 57%. Strong environmental regulations, 56%. High public spending by 55%. And government democratizes private businesses was seen as socialist by 52%, and so on. Now, it's very striking that, first of all, that Harris used a listing of specific programs or policies as a way of trying to see what people understood by this term socialist. But what is it about those things that were on the list that people responded to as socialist? It seems to me that one way of understanding them is to see them as examples of commons. Universal health care, for example, a commons. That is a resource available to everyone, regardless of ability to pay. Where society, in effect, provides for access to valued resources like healthcare, or tuition-free education, that which is being advocated by Bernie, is a commons. As for example, the public school that I went to as a youth. I mean, public education was a commons. We did not think of it as socialist. Growing up in North Dakota, as I did, a very conservative state, very hostile to socialism during the 50s especially. But public education was something that was universally valued. And I went on to the state university. Again, another commons, a socialist institution that is an institution that is socialized in the sense that it is directed to promoting a common good. And now I'm retired, like others of us on this webinar, receiving Social Security. Yeah, that's another commons where society provides benefits for people in their retirement years. And I think that I find it very useful to talk about socialism as a kind of uh, commoning of institutions, rather than the institutions being private, available to people based upon their ability to pay, but rather available to all in common, where society provides valued resources in order to promote human flourishing. Seems to me that that's a way of talking about socialism that would get around the negative connotations that it does still have for many, less so the younger generation, but more so the older generation who were brought up during the Cold War on anti-communist propaganda. So what do you think of that way of approaching a definition of socialism?
Well, the funny thing is, we've increasingly been hearing people talk that way. The right wing is kind of confused when it has to deal with that, because it wants to do things like defund public schools That's the real defunding that's been going on. Defunding colleges and universities, defunding, if you think of the wave of defunding we're in the midst of, with that word never used, but occasionally the word privatize is used, but occasionally it's just a matter of cutting budgets. Public institutions reach out to ways of cutting wages and benefits. And so the Detroit Zoo, which I go to lately almost every day, has taken its food serving staff and disemployed them at the zoo and given them the opportunity to work for another small corporation that's set up, private corporation run by some individuals for private profit without benefits and vacations and sick leave and so on, with reduced salary. And they've given their employees the opportunity to apply for those new jobs doing the same thing they were doing before. What's happened there is something has become privatized. And they don't talk about defunding the food service or the zoo, but that's part of what's going on. And that privatizing there's been a wave of that in the past, since the mid 70s, as I said earlier. And the social, which is socially accepted, social levels of socially provided goods have been cut back, sharply cut back. And people are not protesting it as they should, but what we have a right to as a community. Public schools would be an example. In Detroit, Detroit's the showpiece of Betsy DeVos's work at privatizing a public school system, which has really been dismantled because of the effort to create charter schools and to send children from Detroit, upwardly mobile, highly motivated families, kids going to suburban schools, and the Detroit public school system is decimated. First of all, accrued huge debt, which it can never pay back. So a separate system is set up just to pay the debt. And then secondly, a much smaller school system, which as a graduate of the Detroit public schools, it really pains me enormously to see what's going on. These once proud schools and institutions turned into charter schools, dismantled, not sufficient funding. And I want to say, no, those are social goods. Those are social goods that belong to us collectively as a community. And that concept, social goods belonging to us collectively as a community, that's what you mean by commons. And for me, what socialism entails is extending that to the economy after you've provided it with enough resources to really flourish. Whereas the opposite has been happening. The opposite has been happening for the past whole generation. And so to come back to the motivation of young people, and I mentioned a majority of women in public opinion polls say they would prefer to live under a socialist system. A reason for that is the sense that people want to belong in and live in and provide for a community. Well, if you start with that as a reality, socialism as socialism in United Kingdom or in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, socialism has been the richest and fullest possible way of expanding and extending that sense of community. I mean, during for a period of a generation, and now it's been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking back. But the point is that sense of social belonging and social resources and social dependence is what, when you ask Bernie what he means by socialism, that's what he talks about. And we have now a generation of political people and political activists in, for example, DSA, who are thinking in terms of expanding that commons. Now, expanding it to the economy is the biggest no-no in American life. But even in places like the United Kingdom, in the UK, well, the post office and water and the railroads and the steel and coal, all of those were part of the commons during the high point of social democracy in Europe. And of course, that has shrunk back also. But why go from public schools to a public corporation, to the economy? That's the key link many of us have to think about, because young socialists today have to move in that direction if their socialism is going to have any meaning in the future. But in the meantime, we're playing catch up and we're struggling to get back to where we were 50 years ago.
Don't you think that there is now a growing awareness of the value of public goods? I mean, the pandemic again has shown the utter failure of the public health system in the United States.
Yes.
And that has a lot to do with the way in which things were privatized.
Yes.
Hospitals privatized, the access to health care in the hands of private insurance companies, access to medicine controlled by pharmaceutical industries. All of that privatization actually has made it more difficult for the country to be able to deal with the pandemic. And so I think that there's a lesson there that moves in the direction of growing appreciation of public goods. And I think that's happening in other spheres of life as well.
Yeah, we may be seeing a great reversal starting to happen. I think there's no question of that. There is a need, obviously, never more obviously, the need for a national economic policy, for example. And they're still playing around with that. How do you feed the corporations so that they will produce? How do you put money into people's pockets so they'll purchase? But it's incredibly strong, the need to see ourselves as a society and as a community, and to be able to think about providing for the community. To still do that with the private model and the private industry model, as Zach was saying, is to me a bit crazy.
One of the
Maybe
things
we could, go ahead.
No, one of the things that has been central to, historically to most conceptions of socialism is the notion that it is the working class that will be the bearers of a socialist society. But if you look at the United States today, you have a working class that lacks class consciousness. You find the kind of social energy for change, for progressive change, coming from other kinds of collectivities, whether it be African Americans or Latinos or women or youth. These are all groups that have a collective identity, but you don't really find a class conscious working class politically active in the United States, insofar as members of that class are politically active, you see them as Trump supporters more than anything else. So, what does this spell for the future of the socialist idea?
Well, on the one hand, once you start talking about in any deep way about the problems of American society, you find yourself face to face with Marx and Marxism. You find yourself talking about capitalism. You find yourself talking about the way in which, first of all, the bottom line dominates people's lives, is really a kind of dictatorship over how people live. You find yourself thinking about how capitalism and particularly the need for economic growth is destroying the environment. And you find yourself thinking about the marketization of everything in our life, the way in which the economy drives values, consciousness, and I'm talking about the consumer society, the way in which no one ever voted that the United States should become a consumer society. When it was really being introduced, there was a lot of talk about automation and about reducing the work week, and somehow the decision was made. How? Why? By at the core of the economic system to increase people's consumption of unnecessary goods. It was known at the time that where we were headed was into trying to encourage people to buy unnecessary goods to keep the economy going, not in order to satisfy their needs. Their needs could have been satisfied by social democratic decisions, for example, to work less, but that's not the way it happened. Now, the point is, we're now in a trap of a consumer economy in which so much needs to be bought and sold and consumed in order to keep the economy going, in order to keep us out of economic trouble. So the point is that when you start looking at the problems of American life, you see the role of the capitalist economy. And I talked a little while ago about food service at the Detroit Zoo, or public charter schools for profit, or we're in a world in which the economy is swallowing the rest of social life. Instead of the economy being an adjunct to how people live 300 years ago, by today, people are living dominated in every respect by the economy in terms of values, culture, day to day, in terms of looking around you, and what you see are the capitalist system again and again, writ large. The point is, I don't think you can understand what's happening without Marxism. You can't understand it without seeing the way in which the historical materialism, the idea, works itself out in our lives. That's one half. All of that is one half of understanding where we are today and using Marxism. But the other piece of it is Marxism's anticipation that the working class would become the force, particularly the capitalist working class in advanced industry, which is what Marx had in mind, would become the most abused, pained, and exploited segment of society and would gradually seek to overthrow it. That hasn't happened. That other half of Marxism simply hasn't happened. And one of the problems, and you see it, for example, in Bhaskar Sankara's book, Socialist Manifesto, and you see it among a lot of young people in DSA, is the importance of understanding how capitalism needs to be transformed slides into a belief that it's the industrial working class will somehow find the wherewithal and power to do it. That's not happening. It hasn't happened. And that half of Marx's vision really needs to be rethought. Well, of course, workers, of course, the working class is important. The working class, however, has been transformed in the past 50, 75 years. So it no longer, in the United States, for example, is unionized significantly, is organized, is no longer a force for social progress in the way it was. Which means if we think about all the things that Bernie is talking about, all the things that socialists talked about today, college education for everybody, healthcare, minimum wage, what else? So many of the demands and environmental stewardship of serious control of the environment, or flourishing of the environment, undoing what's happening in terms of the destruction of the environment. Most of these are not working class issues. They're everyone's issues. Getting the economy out of its control over our life. And so my argument would be the socialist movement of the future has to be a universal movement, and it has to draw in the forces that have been in motion. Of course, women, of course, brown and black people, young people, educated young people out of college, and on and on. There have been a lot of forces in motion. And one of those, we hope, will be the working class. And we have to think of socialism in a very different way.
I'd like to push back just a little bit there, Ron, to say that the issues you listed are not working class issues, they're everyone's issues. But in US society, almost everyone is working class. Now, if by working class you're simply referring to the industrial proletariat, with the deindustrialization of the in the 70s and 80s, that sector of the working class has declined. But now still most people are in the working class in that they sell their labor for a wage. Occupy Wall Street put it as the 99%. I think that is not all of that 99% sell their labor for a wage, but most do. There are the professional managerial class and others, but most of the society is working class, whether they conceive of themselves in such terms or not. This whole mythology of the middle class has been very influential in sort of eroding class consciousness among working people. But that does not change people's objective position in society. And today, most of the working class, or increasingly the working class in the US, are those involved in the service sector of the economy. It's a point that Jeff Foe, for example, has written about in his latest book, becoming a servant society. But that's still working class. The challenge, so those issues maybe are not, you don't organize people at the point of production around issues like climate change, for example, or the quality of urban life, or gentrification. You don't organize people at the point of production. You organize people as citizens or as residents of the city, but it is as members of a working class, broadly conceived, that those issues become their issues.
As you continued talking, you made my response, which is that you should have stopped before you talked about citizens and residents and so on, because it's as citizens of the city, it's as citizens of the earth. It's as, you see where that goes. That is to say, our vital interest, we have many vital interest points, right? And certainly one of those vital interest points is people who have to go to a job. But other vital interest points are equally important. And I would say that the movement, the socialist movement, we have to talk about building. It has to appeal to people as workers, of course, but not primarily as workers, and has to get some of the, what should we call it, the Marxist vision out of our heads, that it's centrally the working class that is going to transform the society as working class, but rather, yes, workers and residents of Detroit and Michigan and the United States and the planet, citizens. We have these multiple identities, and we are exploited and oppressed in multiple ways. And yes, it has to be pointed in a democratic way towards capitalism, but it's not really going to be primarily in terms of workers of the world unite. It's got to be something that is thicker than that and unites us more, what I have to say now, more fully. Marx thought that workers of the world unite was going to unite people at the essential place. And maybe for a moment in history that was true, but it's no longer the essential place. Right. There are a multiplicity of them. Maybe we should.
It seems to me that David Harvey's work has been a very fruitful development of Marxist thought, because he's able to see that, for example, urban issues are class issues. Yes. That the right to the city that residents of cities might assert puts them in opposition to developers, to real estate interests, etc. And that is a class issue then. And I think that that if we broaden our Marxism, as David Harvey has done very fruitfully, that helps us get out of the kind of narrowness of much Marxist thought that you have complained about in the past.
Right, right.
We have
it is.
We have people who want to get in on this discussion.
Yes, I've noticed comments in the chat. So why don't we?
I think we should open it up. And I just saw in the chat box a comment by Harry Targ. So let me call on Harry.
If you Mike Mitchell before that, yes.
Oh, hi. I started, first off, my interconnection went out at precisely the strategic point where Ron was defining socialism. And I got back in 10 minutes later, so I probably missed the point. I had two chat items. I was writing at the same time that Cliff was talking about the need to reconceptualize the idea of the working class in the 21st century. And he referred to some of the literature that I like, Guy Standing's notion of the precariat, gig workers, service workers, the informal sector. I once saw an article summarizing a UN study of both the informal sector around the globe, and about 49% of workers in Latin America, the study said, were in the informal sector. So young people today in the United States and elsewhere are experiencing a very different world than the world in which most of us grew up. And I like Ron's idea about conceptualizing the so-called golden age of capitalism, at least that's my label, when we were growing up, where we could assume the possibility of jobs and income and security and having economically a more fruitful life than our parents' generation, and that no longer exists. And so I come to where the position that Cliff is at, that the concept of the 99% was a very useful contribution of the Occupy movement, whether it's 99% or 80% or 70%, but it does suggest that the vast majority of humankind are in a 21st century working class. On another issue, I was starting to think about the elements of conceptualizing socialism. And I thought about different levels of analysis. There's political economy and the traditional idea of of a working class controlling the state. I thought about the level of political institutions, and real democracy, it seems to be, is one way of thinking about socialism. I thought about the cultural level, addressing the kind of questions as a collective belief in the idea of the commons. And I thought about the social psychological level, which probably overlaps with the cultural level, and to accept propositions diametrically opposed to Maggie Thatcher's old idea that there's no such thing as society. So, I think we could sort of disaggregate or all the things that we've talked about today into a set of categories that may make it more possible to talk systematically about the multiple dimensions of socialism. The last thing I wanted to mention is that when I was studying a student, it was before I was exposed to Marx, but I became exposed to that literature on Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, individual versus society, which is replicated in loads of different social theories, from Tunis to Max Weber to Durkheim, and back in the early 60s to the writings that turned me on by Paul Goodman, and probably reflected in the Port Huron statement, the sense of community and vision of community. And I think that sort of is a parallel intellectual development to, growing sort of sympathy and attraction to socialism. Sorry for going on, but.
Okay, there's a lot there. You want to pick up on any of it, Ron?
Yeah, I would just, I liked Harry's sense of complexity. And I think it's useful and important. And however, it brings me back to, I think, something you were talking about earlier, Cliff, and that's, even as I get away from the insistence on the central role of the working class and focusing all of our energy on the working class on the one hand, and want to talk more broadly and more universally, I think we always have to be specific. We can't start getting vague. And that's why I liked what Harry was talking about. We can't start getting vague and flimsy. If we're going to talk universally, there are reasons and times when we should, specifically talking about the environment. But I think we also have to go back in the class theory of Marxism to the notion of the capitalist class, and maybe the capitalist class and its allies. That is to say, who is it who is running the system? Who is it who benefits from the system? And who is it who structurally the system is organized to feed and give power to, and depends on the power of? And there is, I think, a capitalist class. Now that has to be analyzed in terms of who they are very specifically. But I think talking about, what I'm saying is, talking about class society still makes sense.
I had a couple of comments. I don't know if you can hear me or if I need to write this. Can you hear me?
Right. Well, here, just a second. I'll call on you in a moment.
Okay.
But let me say a word about how we should handle these questions, because there are some people who are watching this on YouTube and not able to
Yes.
put their questions directly. And so if you are on YouTube, the way to get a question to us is by emailing it. Send an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will monitor that and pass your question on to those here in the Zoom room. But for those who are in the Zoom room, if you have a question or comment you want to make, just wave at me. I'll have you on gallery view so I can see everybody. Just wave and I can call on you then. So first, let me call on Dion.
Yes, thank you so much. Just a couple of quick comments. One, in terms of, and I definitely understand the concept of reimagining class and the working class, but I would stop short at a certain point because not everybody belongs to what I would call the working class, that statement was made, because there are some corporate executives that make $5 million, $10 million, $20 million a year. I read the other day about an executive that made $100 million a year. I don't think they belong to the same working class that we're talking about, even though it's reimagined and different and should be very inclusive, that there's still a sector, a class that owns everything and really is in a different arena. The other thing I wanted to say was that this is going way back in the presentation. We talked about Black Lives Matter and other social movements and activism and how popular they have become, and amazingly popular. And I want to say it even extends to mass media and the arts, because when I read artistic art magazines, and even in the Detroit Free Press and Detroit News and Time Magazine, whatever, there are a lot of artistic things occurring that reflect on Black Lives Matter, that are expressions of Black Lives Matter, that are compendiums of Black artists, Hispanic artists, Arab American artists. I see it every day in what I read, and I read a lot of different newspapers. For some strange reason, I take 6 newspapers, and there's just so much in there about a diverse art class that is producing diverse artwork. And it's wonderful. So it's just another example of how that Black Lives Matter and other social movements are expanding. It's another whole arena that is very focused right now on African American art and Hispanic art. So just wanted to mention that.
Are there others who
2 important points.
want to be called on? You have to turn your camera on so I can see you. And okay, I see Bob Stone waving. If you'll unmute yourself.
This is a wonderful discussion, and thanks, Ron, for stimulating and guiding it. I wanted to open another perspective, a wider perspective, that in pursuance of the David Harvey's notion of the project, the neoliberal project of having what's called labor arbitrage come into competition with the U.S. working class by opening other economies, Chinese primarily, but many others. I think that project won. I think we can account for the 10% of the labor militancy, labor membership, by the fact that offshoring of production has successfully undermined the negotiating power of our local middle class, working class, and given it no options other than things like identifying with the racist history of the historic working class in the U.S. and and so for me to there is a working class, but it's invisible unless we look at the world labor market and the effect of pitting one working class against another. And make America great again, Trump's slogan really does speak to that. Where am I in this globalized world that the American workers who have been seduced to Trumpism appeal to? They are they're white. They feel entitled, and and they're undermined by what they call globalism, or their word for it. I Make America Great Again is really an appeal to the capitalist class to not forget their white brethren. Among the poor whites of the U.S. So once we open our minds to that global competition of classes, I think we get another perspective that has very practical outcomes. I would favor, for example, a global perspective that is put forth by a group called the Progressive International. It comes out of the European anti-fascist movement. It's led by people like Yanis Varoufakis. It originated in 2018 in a meeting between Varoufakis and Bernie, and its outcomes are things like worker ownership and at the point of production, although that counts as only a very small point in the Harris poll list of socialist undertakings. Only 48% of U.S. workers or U.S. responders to that poll thought of workplace democracy as a socialist goal. But it seems to me that Progressive International should be at least the international affiliation that any U.S. working class would want to embrace, because I don't believe that there's a sort of left exceptionalism that, according to which the liberating ideas are going to come from the U.S. economy. I'm not so sure about that. Here in Mexico, we have a lot of possibilities coming from the global South. So I just wanted to open that perspective.
Okay, Ron.
Well, that's a huge opening, Bob, because if you think about it, the virtually anything you buy nowadays is made, first of all, in China, what percentage, and then other increasingly Asian countries. And we are so totally tied into the international market. The notion of focusing on making America great again, whether from the right or an American socialism from the left, makes very little sense. And the thinking, as you were talking, Bob, about how the world we grew up in started to change rapidly. We were aware of it in the 60s. And then it seemed like maybe things were sort of reverting back to some normal phase in the 70s, but not so. Economic crisis, the oil crisis, the presidency of Jimmy Carter, the sense that the rest of the world caught up economically to the United States. Do you remember that? Do you remember when there was a time in which you could travel in Europe as an American, and the dollar went very far because we really, our standard of living was higher and we were a wealthier society. That stopped in the mid 70s. And there's been change after change after change. And now the changes are so incredibly rapid. That's where I hear you taking, trying to stand, looking around those changes that are so rapid. And yes, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to transform but the whole global economy in order to protect the global environment. If you think of the scale of the changes economically, number one, and number two, the scale of the threat ecologically, without a global perspective, we can't get very far, obviously. And it's more homework for the rest of us, but absolutely necessary.
If you look at the industrial workforce globally, 80% of it is in the global South.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the end of World War II, almost all of the industrial workforce was in the US. But now, the US has been deindustrialized. We have a question here from Celia Pachaco, who I want to display here because it's a rather lengthy one. But she writes, I'm listening to the webinar. Congratulations for this splendid work. Today, how can workers fight? Recently, I'm professor in a public university at Mexico City. Many abuses are committed at the moment, and it was not possible to break out the strike because there were no conditions. I very much agree with the fight for socialism, but it is very difficult at the moment. In Mexico, there are countless active struggles, even with the pandemic, struggles that come from long ago for water, territory, access to services such as electricity, between others that are now intensifying, such as access to health services is absolutely necessary, to which are added the struggle for internet services that are private and computer equipment to study. Gender and family violence have escalated, and all this is adding to unemployment. Today, how can workers fight? I might add, she speaks of these as issues for workers. That is, their working class issues. Okay.
Yes. How can workers fight? It's the question. How can we fight? I think I can say that's sort of the question I was asking in my book, We, Reviving Social Hope. The sense that there are so many issues, so many fronts to fight on, that Celia, as you've outlined it, it seems overwhelming. As Bob suggested it seems overwhelming. And it will seem overwhelming. We know more than we ever knew, and yet we feel like we know less because the issues are so many and so serious and so systemic in different ways. And I think in order to cope with that, one needs to find the place to fight, the place that is appropriate for you and may be comfortable for you, and to connect with other people and to talk together and to take the action that's appropriate for you collectively, which will be small scale. It's not going to be huge scale, it's going to be small scale. And I think by doing that, your sense of it becomes transformed. And what I mean is, your action will only become on the scope and scale of the problems as more and more and more and more people act, or as people act in different spheres, and it begins to have a cascading effect. But we can overwhelm ourselves, and this is part of the point I make in that book. We can overwhelm ourselves with our analysis. We have to be responsible for it. We have to be intelligent about it. But we can overwhelm ourselves for analysis because there's a moment where you have to step into some form of action and sustain that action, which will invariably be on a small scale and might get larger and larger if you're fortunate. But it's that experience of acting that redeems some of the frustration we feel at looking into the enormous problem. I don't know if that helps.
Okay, other questions or comments?
I want to make sure I say hello to Ben and Sonia. I've seen you there. Where are you? Oh, their sound is off, but it's wonderful to see you. Can you turn Ben's mic on so we can hear where he is, and Sonia?
Hi, we're in Oberlin, Ohio, with about 8
You're
inches.
still there in Oberlin.
About 8 inches of snow outside. Well, we'd rather be in London, but we kind of got stuck here with the pandemic. But yeah,
Yes, right.
so
Okay. Good to see you.
it's good to see you all.
In the chat box, Mike
Mike Mitchell has a question.
yeah, has followed up on this question. How can workers fight? He writes, the struggle has to be multi-level.
You've gotten hung up a little, Cliff. The sound got interrupted here. Maybe start
Okay.
again.
All right. The struggle has to, can you hear me better now?
Yes, fine.
The struggle has to be multi-level, workers, politicians, and movements. Workers fight on their own, fighting on their own is limited. The question for workers is how far to go or how big is possible and necessary.
Good.
You know, a few weeks ago, we had a webinar that included Jane McAlary, who is a union organizer. And she pointed out that really, from the point of view of unions that are trying to strengthen their position and grow their membership, they need to reorient their organizing efforts to more community-oriented issues rather than limiting it to the point of production. But it's necessary to see workers as whole persons, whole social beings who have many roles in life. And oftentimes they can be most effectively reached if they're fighting, well, rent increases due to gentrification in their neighborhood. And that becomes then a fruitful arena for unions to work and organize in.
Right. I remember a button from the 1960s, must have been around 69 or 70, that my daughter, who was born in 68, started to wear. Some of you will remember this: one struggle, many fronts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that conceptualization is right. And I think that's part of what we're talking about.
Okay, Ben has his hand raised. Unmute yourself.
Yes, I've been doing research and advocacy and activism around disaster risk for more than 50 years. And I'm talking about hurricanes and earthquakes and landslides and floods. I think there may be one front in the single struggle that's very, very poorly represented. And it's those people who are marginal and been marginalized, and literally marginal people quite often are socially, spatially allocated to marginal places, floodplains, unstable slopes, in Naucalpan in the north of Mexico City, for instance, in outside Bogota, and so forth. Not even before we start talking about drought and other agricultural hazards and the marginalization of small farmers. It's not that these groups of people have been neglected. In fact, they have been marginalized increasingly by processes we've already talked about, such as overseas direct investment in land grabs, expansion of agribusiness, and so forth. I think, and maybe I'd like to hear Ron or maybe somebody else comment on what I am seeing increasingly, not as people living in precarity, but people who are not acknowledged to have the right to exist at all. They are a global surplus population from the point of view of capitalism, from the point of view of the state. When you look at so many state policies, country by country, in relation to reducing disaster risk. Let me leave it at that. Do you want to comment, Ron, or anybody else? Bob, anybody?
Question is an awareness of them growing, Ben, or are they pretty much forgotten, period? What is happening in terms of?
Well, my reading is that there isn't is not a growing awareness. I mean, there is an international UN organization, a UN agency, the International Secretariat for Disaster Reduction, but it really isn't addressing the marginalization process, that is the creation of risk. They're only addressing how to adapt or adjust to risk. They take risk for granted, essentially as an act of God, although they no longer are silly enough to actually say that. But they haven't moved very far from this hazard-focused understanding of risk, of natural risk, in the direction that I prefer, which is a vulnerability centered approach, which asks, well, why are some people more vulnerable than others? And then you start going through the social, economic, political, ecological, and other factors that make them so. So I would say there's still obfuscation. There's still there's not growing awareness as such. No.
Well, among
So I
the
guess-
more marginalized people in the global South are indigenous peoples uh, who's who sit on resources that are coveted by transnational corporations, either for mining or oil drilling or whatever. But they sit on resources, and their livelihood depends on those resources, on the land, and they're fighting back to try to protect and preserve their way of life. But they are in the way of capitalism, and capital tries its best to make them even more marginal by just pushing them out of existence.
Cliff's got an interesting point, which is that excuse me, that the marginalization doesn't just happen. It's a social and economic process, and there are forces at work. And that doesn't answer your question, Ben, but it shines a certain light on it, that this is not, it's not nature. You know this, of course. It's not nature making this happen. And I guess what's important here, which we would all agree, is bringing those processes, social and economic, class processes, yes, bringing them to wider awareness, as has happened in other cases. Now, I guess I would just want to call all of our attention to the cases where certain Native American groups, in the way of quote unquote progress, have mobilized and reached out and got support and become visibly seen and understood as water protectors in, certain regions of the United States. What is that? South Dakota, North Dakota. That this is an appropriate cause for people to become involved in. Writing, speaking, organizing. And one would hope that efforts like your own, can reach one more person and two more people and three more people and create the kind of awareness, and one would hope organizing activity. I see this as a, what should we say, as a political organizing activist problem. So that these people aren't marginalized / forgotten by the world. And the processes that have marginalized them are linked in to the global North, I'm sure, and have linked in to the capitalist system. And there's a huge role here for publicizing and creating networks of people of concern. So it's that we know that, and you know that, but it's that's what has to happen. That's what has to happen. And we can probably find cases. You can probably find cases, because you've studied cases of situations where awareness has grown because of people traveling and publishing, and then some political activism and some organization, and then the United Nations, and so on and so forth. And in the specific locations you're talking about, that's the kind of thing that has to happen.
The doctrine of the unseen hand is a license to ignore those without money. And on a global scale, it's death to these groups we're speaking of. Berta Cáceres, for example, was defending a river in Honduras and had to be taken out of the way, had to be assassinated. We have friends of the center who were with her actually when she was shot. I'm just realizing how it's Sonia and Ben. I didn't recognize you. So happy to see you. But surely that helps us understand that old-fashioned doctrine helps us understand how in this system those folks don't have a title to life. They're not entitled to life. They can be ignored because they can't. But this COVID reminds us that you can't just let those folks go. We are all of the same species being. If we don't help, if we don't include the precariat, I hate that word because it implies there's yet another class. It's the same working class that's the precariat. And those in the reserve army of unemployed are part of it, and including the indigenous bioriferous here in Mexico.
Well, we're running late on time. Any final questions or comments that anyone wants? Or any closing words that you want to bring to us, Ron?
I just want to go back, and I think Ben's comment question pushed me in that direction. I want to go back to the opposition, the enormous opposition between the kind of analysis we're doing about the global phenomena of capital and its many manifestations and the various forms of inequality and oppression. And as we think about it, we have to think about it. We have to work on it. We have to work on our corner of it, and we have to respect that there's a larger picture as well, on the one hand. But it's overwhelming to stop there. And if we stop there, we will be overwhelmed. We will walk away depressed. And what changes that is what I was talking about with Ben, but what we're talking about every time we think in terms of talking about with Celia as well, that you have to connect with what's going on. You have to organize, you have to participate, and you have to be part of a working group. And that working group not only gives you energy in life, it transforms what you're dealing with. Because what you're dealing with, which is global, is also local and individual and can be focused on. And when you focus on it, it's not just the system, it's those bastards. And it's how do I get around them or stop them or survive them? And when we're working on the level of those bastards, we're alive and energetic, and somehow the total global aspect of the problem becomes focused for us. That's when I write about hope, that's what I mean, when you get to that point.
We're very grateful to you, Ron, for your book, We. It's an amazing accomplishment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And on behalf of everyone, I want to thank Ron for sharing his insights with us today. That are informative, and stimulating. And I hope that that everyone enjoyed this as I know many of you have enjoyed past programs. This has been recorded. It will be available on our website if you want to refer others to it. All of our past programs are also available on the website at globaljusticecenter.org. Let me say a word. Next Monday, Harry Targ, who is here with us today, will be one of the speakers in a webinar on struggles against racism, the history of class and white supremacy, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He will be speaking along with his colleague Valerie Chapman from Purdue University. So I hope that you'll tune in next Monday and many other Mondays as well. But I thought that we might go out something a little different. We might go out with some music. A song that captures much the spirit of what we have been talking about. Have you been to jail for justice?
Was it Cesar Chavez? Maybe it was Dorothy Day. Some will say Dr. King or Gandhi set them on their way. No matter who your mentors are, it's pretty plain to see. If you've been to jail for justice, you're in good company. Have you been to jail for justice? I want to shake your hand. Sitting in and lying down are ways to take a stand. Have you sung a song for freedom or marched that picket line? Have you been to jail for justice? Oh, you're a friend of mine. You law-abiding citizens, listen to this song. Laws were made by people, and people can be wrong. Once unions were against the law, but slavery was fine. Women were denied the vote and children worked the mine. The more you study history, the less you can deny it. A rotten law stays on the books till folks with guts defy it. Have you been to jail for justice? I want to shake your hand. Sitting in and lying down are ways to take a stand. Have you sung a song for freedom or marched that picket line? Have you been to jail for justice? Oh, you're a friend of mine. Now the law's supposed to serve us, and so are the police. When that system fails, it's up to us to speak our piece. It takes eternal vigilance for justice to prevail. So get courage from your convictions. Let them haul you off to jail. Have you been to jail for justice? I want to shake your hand. Sitting in and lying down are ways to take a stand. Have you sung a song for freedom or marched that picket line? Have you been to jail for justice? Will you go to jail for justice? Have you been to jail for justice? Oh, you're a friend of mine.
All right, well, thank you. That's a good note to go out out on. And thank you once again. If people want to hang around for a while, if people want to hang around for some chit chat, since a number know one another, we'll sign off now from our broadcast. Thank you again.
Thanks, Cliff. And thanks, Bob. Thanks to the center. And thanks everybody for showing up.
Great session. Wonderful discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
Bravo, bravo.
Mhm.
Well, Ron,
Hola, Celia. ¿Qué tal?
Ron, a couple years ago, the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship here invited you to speak one Sunday. You got ill and were not able to do it, but maybe sometime in the future, once we're past COVID, you'll be able, or even now during this COVID era, you don't have to actually be here. You could still speak.
Yeah, sure.
Come on back.
Yeah.
I'd like to come back. I like to sit in the Jardin and go up to Jardin Botanico.
Mhm.
It would be a special treat to introduce you to Celia Pacheco.
Yes.